I have always really enjoyed magical classes in basically any game that I play, and in LOTRO that is no exception with the Lore Master, except lately I haven't played it too much. I've explained a lot more in a couple of my recent videos on the Lore Master if you want some more background, but basically Standing Stone Games is working on a Lore Master update, or refresh as they are calling at least the Guardian and Beorning updates, and we have a lot of new information from what we previously had. Now, I will point out that this has actually been out for a while, and I wasn't originally planning on doing a video on this, but I thought that I had the time and it was something I'm just really invested in talking about because I really do want to like the Lore Master. Again, I'm drawn to mage-like classes in a lot of games. The first class I was actually drawn to in LOTRO was the Lore Master, yet I just haven't had as much fun with them lately, and I think there's a lot of potentially interesting things to get to. Now, the focus today, as you saw in the character I was spec'd in the blue line, we're going to focus on one of their proposed blue line changes, but I am going to get to everything that they have here. So to get started, let's look at what the 3 Lore Master lines would look like. And I actually want to highlight the very last sentence of this section because I think it's really important and a great thing to actually read. That they can say with certainty that the red line should be a competent, competitive DPS specialization, and also importantly, the yellow line will remain a fully fledged support specialization. I think those two things are great to read, but that leaves us with a big question of the blue line, and that's all covered here. So they were thinking about making the blue line a passive tree, which I think could make sense. It would be sad to lose it as a pet-based specialization, but that's exactly what I'm going to be talking a little bit more about, because right now they're considering turning Blue Lore Master into an alternative to the Redline Captains for group content. Now, the Redline Captain buffs allies and in particular focuses on buffing their damage and giving your fellowship an overall damage boost. So if the Lore Master gets that changes for the blue line, as on Mahal says here, they would be an offensive group support with a little bit less damage than Redline Lore Masters. Now, before we continue on too much, something I was curious about was, does Blue Line Lore Master actually have any theme that's related to Red Line Captain and boosting ally damage? So I've looked through pretty much all these traits, and most of them are, not all that effective because they impact pets, which are just totally bonked with their scaling and do very terribly at high levels besides their specific debuffs that they're used for. I actually found very little that the Blue Line Lore Master does for group support in terms of buffing, in particular the Lore Master overall. Like, they have few skills that actually function as basically buffs for your allies. You basically have Sign of Power Righteousness here, which can give you immunity and stun immunity ability, and then you also have like Water Lore, which is a heal over time. But actually hiding in the set bonuses for the Blue Line Lore Master, there are actually 2 things that buff your allies. So it does have there's a little bit of a warrant for the Blue Line Lore Master becoming a buffing spec. So you can buff the tactical mitigation of your allies with the Raven pet. I also realized that I'm playing on my low level Lore Master. I know that's not ideal for people that are maybe more familiar with the level 140 stats, but just to point out, that's 1k tactical mitigation, which for this character, it's a moderately decent boost at this level. And then the other source of buffing is going to be from Fellowship Friend here, which depending on the pet that you have out, when your pet scores a critical hit, you will actually get a buff depending on that pet. So the Lynx and Sabertooth Cat there give you a little bit, you and your Fellowship, a little bit extra melee damage. Bog Guardian makes sense, it'll be range damage and range critical chance on top of that. That's very heavy favor for range compared to the Lynx and the Sabertooth. And then for a little bit more defensive options with the Raven and Eagle, you get reduced incoming tactical damage, and the bear gives reduced incoming damage overall. So while it's very minor and kind of hidden in the set bonuses and perhaps not the most obvious if you just read the actual description of the trait tree and basically its overall theme of Keeper of Animals, you probably wouldn't immediately think of it as a fellowship buffing spec, but again, it has a couple of those themes hidden throughout. Still, one of the big questions for this video that I just wanted to propose is, should Blue Line Lore Master actually become a Red Line Captain alternative? Should that become its main theme rather than your actual pets, as it currently is a pet-based spec? This is currently the only pet-based spec actually in the entire game. While the Captain is the other class that has a pet system, they do not have any particular spec that focuses solely on the pets, while Lore Master does. That's actually one of the draws of the Blue Line Lore Master. While I personally would actually typically prefer to play Redline because I like the destructive nature of it. I also really do like having a proper pet-based spec, and you know what? I probably would play it more frequently if it were actually viable and had more maybe to do with the pet system, more interaction with your pets, maybe more abilities, kind of like the Beastmaster Hunter in World of Warcraft has. They really dive headlong into the pet theme with that spec for the class. So that's why probably in the previous video you heard me talk a lot about that I think that the Blue Line Lore Master should really focus in on the pet-based, like a DPS spec for the Lore Master that's focused on pets. They of course can take in all the utility that Lore Master has, and it's not a problem if they have some debuff support. Even some buff support like they have now wouldn't necessarily be a problem, but I really don't know that I'm initially a fan of the idea of it becoming the primary focus. Like when you're thinking of taking a Lore Master at endgame content, if you spec in the Blue Line, that's a Redline Captain alternative. I personally would tend to prefer it to just be an alternative DPS spec. So you have the Redline DPS spec, which is based on the Lore Master damage, and then you have the Blue Line spec, which is pet based and focused on, of course, the pet damage a little bit more. It's kind of similar to, say, Blue Line Hunter and Redline Hunter, how I describe those two. Redline Hunter, I personally think that both Redline Hunter can be a viable DPS along with Blue Line Hunter. Sure, they do it a little bit differently, and Blue Line has the mobility, which can give them a little bit of an edge in certain situations. Maybe Redline has better AoE and better burst damage to give them a little bit of an edge in certain situations. And depending on how you play the game, what you want to do, you could pick and choose between the two. And I really would love to see it be these like similar idea, at least for the Lore Master, where Blue Line Lore Master could be a viable DPS and Redline as well. So with that out of the way, I'm going to start diving into their current thoughts a little bit deeper, and please do let me know what you think about that and if the Blue Line Lore Master should become a Redline Captain alternative. I will, as a little preview, probably read some of the forum comments. That's a new thing with the video, but just an idea I had to see what other people are perhaps thinking in this thread. But we have a lot to get to here. I am, just as a heads up, going to gloss over a lot of the Yellow Line stuff because I'm honestly less familiar with it, and just for my personal interest, less interested in it. So to get started here, a little bit of a deeper dive. They said that the most difficult aspect of keeping both blue and yellow as specializations and not just become supplemental traits for the other specs is actually keeping blue and yellow separate and distinct. And that's actually goes completely contrast what I was just talking about with keeping the maybe blue and red line distinct as two DPS based specs that again can have some support and utility. But right now it looks like they're actually thinking players are able to acquire so many traits in a non-spec tree. So yeah, if you spec'd into Blue Line Lore Master, you could just get all the Yellow Line traits and perhaps become very support based while having all the additional whatever sort of pet stuff they could do in the Blue Line. And then you'd essentially be able to treat one of the trees as being passive anyway. It's actually kind of interesting. It's a little bit different, but with the Beorning, actually, if you are a Redline Beorning, you can do the traditional DPS specialization with it, but you can actually spec your Redline Beorning. Redline is a DPS spec, but you can spec it to be a support build for your character, even though you're specialized into the red line, because you pick so many useful support traits from the yellow line as well as the blue line. You become a support Redline Beorning. It's kind of odd, but it has that similar idea where you're not even really playing your specialization's role. Anyway, that out of the way, one of the big issues with the Lore Master as a whole, not just the Blue Line, is pet rotation. So that's what they start off the pet section with. And basically, one of the things that they are thinking about is that you get a skill that you actually use that's based on your pet. Instead of your pets having all their own special abilities that apply certain debuffs or whatever, you, yourself as the Lore Master, get an ability just for numbers that they have right now. They're thinking potentially like, you get plus 5% incoming tactical damage if you have the Raven out. It's a 1 minute ability, 1 minute duration ability with a 20-second cooldown. So you could technically apply this 3 times, which does mean that you could, as they say here, dismiss your Raven, and summon a Lynx that applies, for example, minus 5% physical mitigation for 1 minute, but it also doesn't reset the existing cooldown. So basically every 20 seconds you could use the skill and apply the debuff, and there will still be the pet rotation. You could rotate 3 pets with a system like this. I will say this is the type of thing that I think is better than the current situation we have now. If we had a 1 minute cooldown skill that you actively used as a Lore Master but still had to rotate your pets and could do it every 20 seconds, I'd consider that better than the current pet rotation and pet cycling that we have in the game right now. But I think one of the big questions that should be asked is, why even have any sort of pet cycling mechanic or pet rotation mechanic like this? Because I think a better solution, at least for me and my enjoyment with the Lore Master, would be to just like totally get rid of pet cycling rather than have like a specific mechanic for it to be in the game, rather than perhaps a little bit less than intended mechanic as it is right now. Kind of like the old weapon swapping. And I believe the last time that I talked about pet cycling, a lot of people also answered that they didn't really like the idea of pet cycling. So I imagine if y'all are interested in sharing your thoughts, it would be pretty similar now as well. Now, as far as the pet skills themselves having cooldowns, the ones to summon the pets, I don't see that being a huge problem. I think one thing that they could really do is actually have your pets have a revive pet type thing, because if I remember correctly, I'm starting to get games confused, but I don't think that is a thing that lore masters have right now. You can't just revive your dead pet, you have to summon another pet essentially, and if you have all your pet summoning skills on cooldown, then you couldn't do that if your pet dies. But I think one important thing here that I might have glossed over is that each pet itself would have a cooldown, so it's not a shared cooldown between all of your pets, which I think would work a lot better because you should never be left totally petless, and that would actually work out. And I think given the technical limitations that they have, that resummoning a pet just creates a total new entity in the game, and that means you like have everything reset full health, cooldowns all ready to go. They can use their taunts notably and just other debuffs right away when you summon them. I actually like this compared to, as they say here, having assume that the pet cooldowns are like 2 seconds basically. They would have to nerf a lot of pet skills, which I agree is kind of contrasts the core fantasy of the class design. So good to see that, and I think I would like that. And then as well, the return to master skill here could be used in combat with a moderate cooldown here. So you can, if your pet, as they say here, decides to arrive inside a nearby rock, you could actually get your pet to you quicker and do it in combat now. And then the other important part is going to be, what do the pets look like? Now, I have to be honest, I already looked through this list and actually did it on stream, so I shared my thoughts on it, and there's a lot of details here for each of the pets if you're interested, but I think one of the perhaps more important parts is actually what's going to be their general target for what the pets will look like and how they contribute. So I think the first thing is pets should be contributing a non-arbitrary amount of damage. I think that is great, and really good to see that they are actually targeting making the pets not terrible as they are right now. So the targeted values that they would have, this is probably with level 140 numbers just as a reference. So the Lynx would do 100,000 single target DPS and has about 40% mitigation. Saber Cat's a little bit more defensive, so has a bit more survivability baked into it. And if you're fighting 3 targets, it'll do 150k AoE damage. So 2 targets would be similar to the Lynx. 1 target, it would be about half the Lynx DPS, but 3 targets, it would do more, so actually useful in AoE. And then your Bog Guardian has utility of being range DPS. It's also a little bit less mitigation, but it gets close to the Lynx damage, not quite as much though. The Eagle here is a little bit interesting. I know it has some more solo-based utility with being able to revive you and such, and depending on how they work in, like, any sort of buffing mechanic or other support mechanics with these specializations, then it could have some other things, but looks like a little bit less damage, but a lot more sturdy. And then the Raven will do quite a bit less damage than the previous ones, probably still going to be focused a lot around its specific effects and debuffs, so it looks like it would be a utility choice and benefit from blue line traits with their current thinking. That's probably with the red line alternative thinking. And then finally, the bear would still hopefully be a good solo tank option. And I don't know, we'll scroll up to see perhaps any group content mentions that they have here, but does a little bit less damage as well, but has really high mitigations. So as far as their thinking with the bear, it is actually at the end here. So this would still be strongest with inherent defenses, retain its taunt, and perhaps they'll be able to return the ability to use the bear taunt inside instances, which could actually be useful, but sounds like it'd be the stock tank that it has always been in LOTRO for lore masters. So I do want to highlight that while the numbers can always be adjusted to whatever they need to be, I think the general idea that they have here is really solid, and it's a good fundamental place to start with where they want the pets to be. I think just having a good baseline, Lynx is basically your baseline for a like stock standard melee DPS target of 100,000, then you can vary all the other pets based on that single target melee DPS. They're also talking a little bit about inductions here. I know some people have commented that they'd like to see the lore masters have just all the inductions removed. Personally, I wouldn't be as big of a fan of that because it's one of the few very heavy induction-based induction-based classes, I should say. For the red and blue line, it'd be induction-based specializations that are left in the game, but it looks like they are just considering maybe making it a little bit more comparable if you are a low level and high level minstrel, where you have a lot of regular inductions at low levels, but then at high levels you can get a ton of minus induction buff stacked up. You attack, or your inductions are at least are very fast. And I think this kind of rings true with the idea that I was saying earlier. Lore Masters remain slow and steady induction class, but capable of significant output and left unimpeded. I think this is also a really big thing that I actually did not see in my skimming earlier, but they said they will clean up any post-skill delay or self-fruits where a skill appears to be completely finished, yet you're still unable to begin your next action. Very conveniently, I'm logged into this character, and I think Light of the Rising Dawn, after I cast the ability, my character is stuck there. I tried to move, I was holding the movement key that entire time, and let's see, Lightning Strike, that one does it as well. So I don't know if that's the type of thing they're talking about cleaning up. And then Cracked Earth, I know, is another big one. So you use the skill, animation's not done, but the induction's done. Then you have the post-induction animation, and then your character is going to be rooted during that, even though you can press your movement key. And it's not the smoothest of things. I'd say that's my biggest complaint with the Lore Master, almost a clunky feeling for the class, is how I would describe it. That compared to other classes in LOTRO with updates throughout the year and such, it just doesn't feel up to par. And I think that's another thing that almost subconsciously maybe is another reason I haven't been as big of a fan of the Lore Master, even though I like the induction style. It's just the post-skill delay and self-fruits are, I think, actually a pretty big part of making Lore Master gameplay perhaps not as enjoyable as it should be. Anyway, moving on to the last part of this post, which will be bad traits. So posts below do not address every single lackluster trait. We would be here for hours. We're going to be here a long time, but if we had to go through that, so we'll just have to wait for a full revision outline, or whenever this gets into beta, to actually play around with it, which I think is going to be important, and one of the reasons I haven't dived too much into the Hunter work that they have talked about, even though I do have some thoughts on that. And as we get into their general skill changes, I actually think Dispel Corruption, this is a great idea for an ability that can actually be impacted by the pet that you have out. So it looks like the bear is going to be a short cooldown, remove 1 corruption from the target. If you have a bird type pet out, it's 3 different corruptions. I wonder if that could count as 3 of the same corruption, 3 tiers. But anyway, 15-second cooldown, so a little bit longer but more efficient in the long run. Cats could be 2 corruptions and small AoE. That's kind of interesting with 20-second cooldown. Bog Guardian going to be 1 from AoE and large AoE, that is. 20-second cooldown. And finally, Spirit could be 1 corruption and restore morale if corruption is removed. That one sounds least exciting, but I personally find the Spirit to be the least exciting pet, even though it's not like a useless pet or anything like that. And I think that makes sense for the Spirit. But I actually really like this, and I hope as I go through this, because I haven't actually looked at a lot of these, that we see a lot of things like this to make the Lore Master really feel like a pet class that actually emphasizes the pet aspect, and you get different things for utility abilities like this based on the pet that you have out. So that's a great start. So Knowledge of Cures, lose its induction, be usable on the move. Sounds like just quality of life improvement. A lot of other classes are on a similar level at this point. Now, what I'm kind of interested in is Blinding Flash. This is a skill that is an interrupt. It's an immediate ability, so you can quickly use it to interrupt an enemy, but it also is one of your big crowd control abilities, and that it's a 30-second daze. So that is one of your big mez abilities as a Lore Master. So they're thinking they could pass the interrupt to another ability. Light of the Rising Dawn is interesting because I actually think it has the same issue of that's like already used for the stun, perhaps not very frequently, but something to consider that it's still like one of those abilities where it's has its own use outside of having an interrupt attached to it. And Wizard's Frost, Wizard's Fire, and yes, Wizard's Lightning, that is a new one. I'm actually going to get to that in a moment because I want to check for abilities that we already have. I think there's a really interesting conversation to be had with those. So for Sticky Tar, considering changing it to Tactical Mitigation, it might reduce uptime. And then it looks like, yeah, they're just looking to reduce the over-reliance perhaps on tar and catmint. That is something to keep in mind with that as well. And then Ancient Craft is going to be one of those debuffs that I'm less familiar with. Burning Embers. So the damage over time component of this will be changed to allow partial pulses. So that means that it will not be able to crit, I believe, yeah. But when you upgrade or downgrade the dot, the tier will not result in a lost pulse, which I think that's probably a good thing for consistency overall. It's unfortunate that that does mean that it would be unable to crit, but they can always balance around that. So it looks like the other thing with these skills dots that they're not pleased about is going to be the max tier dot and the Ettenmoors. Okay, takes absolute ages to expire on you. That reminds me of the Runekeeper's Writs. I don't know if Writ to Fire is still the same way. It's been a while, but Writ of Health at least used to be that way. Perhaps that's something if they could implement a PvMP specific change. I really hate PvE things getting neutered based on PvP. It's something in WoW that happened for a while, but they finally kind of got around to fixing with PvP talents. I'm less familiar with that than I used to be. I would really hope that something like this is not changed just for PvMP, because long-lasting dot is, to me, fairly exciting. Even if it's a minor thing, it just adds to excitement and enjoyment overall from playing a Redline Lore Master with Burning Embers. Anyway, Cracked Earth. So it looks like they will split that into two variants. Base version with higher damage but no root. That sounds like the great thing for a red line lore master, but then maybe a blue line lore master and yellow line lore master could be one where you could get, I guess they're targeting perhaps a trait in the yellow tree that adds the root. I think that's actually a pretty good idea. I'd like to see that for red lore master, while the root losing that would of course perhaps give some impact on soloing on a lore master. It would really dive headlong more into the theme of higher damage, which I think would make sense with the red line spec. And then you could always, if you wanted, I suppose, depending where it is in the yellow tree, trade it if you want. Moving on though, for Gust of Wind, they're just going to do firm baseline damage increase. You can do a lot of different things with numbers, but if we're talking about relative damage to other abilities, it seems like it'd be a good thing if it does relatively more. And then Pleasant Breeze, isn't that a yellow line thing where it can trigger like some fellowship heal that you can do? If I remember correctly, but only has a place in your damage rotation, so you probably wouldn't want to use it as a yellow line lore master, or at least wouldn't want to use it for Pleasant Breeze, would want to use it in damage rotation. So I think that'll be good. And then Knowledge of Lore Master is one of the debuffs, but they're considering changing how it is used in combat versus out of combat, I believe. And then Sign of Power Vigilance, that is actually the stealth detection, and it looks like they're considering changing that. Give a secondary effect, reduce incoming damage as well for a brief window. Yeah, I could see that. Hopefully it's not a thing that you always want to maintain in like regular PvE combat, but I don't have too many thoughts on that really. Sign of Power Command, that's going to be one of the debuffs, considering changing it. And then Sign of Power See All In. So this is the first thing that we're actually seeing with a new buff theme for the Blue Line Lore Master. So this is one that could become a player buff rather than a monster debuff. And this is in Redline could give you a temporary damage buff that you would get like right now from Inner Flame. In Blue Line, it could be a targeted buff that is equivalent to the Captain Redline 2 arms. So your target gains a strong buff and the rest of your group gains a slightly lesser buff is how that would work. Again, first thing that I have directly seen as a Redline Captain competer, basically. And then Staff Strike and Staff Sweep, those are interesting. There's a lot of interesting things with these. I think Lore Master could honestly not be a bad candidate for a fourth specialization that actually focuses on melee, but that's a conversation for a whole other time. But for these, they're a little bit mixed about having two melee only skills, which are, yeah, it's kind of tough, I think, to have two melee only skills, which are like, their primary use is to improve your DPS. So it looks like Tar and Ring of Fire encourage, playing within melee range. So they aren't the only melee oddballs. It's kind of like Yellow Runekeeper actually has some things for your melee range, even though they're not really a melee spec, and kind of end up being in melee a lot to play optimally. But they also don't want lore masters to feel forced into melee range. Yeah, I think that's a good thing. So to me, I don't dislike these abilities, but I definitely don't like the idea of feeling like I need to use them to optimize my rotation. I think having them have maybe some utility effect could be perhaps a little bit more interesting if you're stuck in melee with AoE, want to use Staff Sweep or Staff Strike. Like right now, if you're in Redline, you can get the Sword and Storm trigger to give a stun on your enemy. It's a long cooldown with 60 seconds, but I don't know, something like that. I think I talked earlier at one point about Staff Sweep, having something similar, perhaps an AoE stun like that. I don't know, kind of interesting and give it some of that utility component. Let me know what you all think about those two. And then Light of Hope, just increase heal. All right then. Wisdom of the Council, reduce cooldown. This is the I'm in trouble emergency cooldown. Heal me. Give me 50% of my morale and a little bit of a chance to negate actually damage and reflect a tiny bit of damage and stun enemies with the reflect. And then Inner Flame. This is a somewhat needlessly complicated skill. I increase. So 3 uses of it, you increase your damage. And then shift somewhere all the offensive weight off of the skill into Redline trait tree, possibly a skill combo with one of the cat pets like the Sign of Power that they were talking about earlier. And yeah, I agree that Inner Flame should be entirely reworked. Okay, that's actually a little bit awkward, and that I completely forgot that they fixed the exploit where you could use Inner Flame, where you could actually use Inner Flame and move before the channel triggered and you would get the buff, but I forgot that they actually changed it so you get the full buff while it's inducting, essentially, which gives you increased fire and lightning damage while also giving you and your pet a little bit of a heal. It is actually, by the way, now a pretty strong heal. I just completely forgot that they changed that because it has been a hot minute since I've really been on this character. Again, hopefully these changes make me play my Lore Master more frequently where I would remember that. Anyway, good idea there. So I think next up, we have Wizard's Fire, Wizard's Frost, and Wizard's Lightning. And what's really interesting, I believe in this video I talked about how I really think that the Lore Master could use a sort of new core rotational ability, because a lot of your big powerhouse abilities have long cooldowns. If I spec'd into the Redline, we could see that with something like Nature's Fury, a 1.5-minute cooldown, Lightning Storm, a 1.5-minute cooldown, Ring of Fire and Sticky Gourd, both 30-second cooldowns, which I'm not necessarily against the big powerhouses having these long cooldowns. You can't use them that frequently, but they're really huge powerhouses, and it's just different than other classes. It's, you can't use those super exciting abilities frequently, but that's part of what makes them super exciting when they are off cooldown. So to me, the biggest rotational problem that I have found on the Lore Master is that when you don't have these longer cooldown abilities available, it just feels a little bit thin, like you're just missing something. And perhaps Wizard's Fire, Wizard's Frost, and their new Wizard's Lightning, if they made all 3 of these core rotational abilities, even if they don't have an induction, if they have some use where you want to actually use them as sort of fillers even, or just in your regular rotation, that could perfectly solve the complaint that I actually brought up, and perhaps even both of those videos. But let's see, right now, very speculatively, it includes Wizard's Lightning. So curious how folks would feel about these being baseline to class, and then they gain effects, targets, or whatever from your spec trees. So you would have easy access to the fire lightning damage output, and you could proc something like Out in the Cold, playing with fire effects that I'm not immediately familiar with those names, and then ability to consume pet flank effects. So again, basically I already said all my thoughts on having this. I think there's some great potential with that idea of having perhaps these 3 abilities become a core part of the regular Lore Master gameplay, at least in terms of DPS. Maybe that's something the Redline could do. Boost the damage of perhaps something like Wizard's Lightning could be a big Redline thing, and Wizard's Fire, I don't know, could be a blue line thing, and Wizard's Frost could be a debuff thing for yellow line. Just spitballing some ideas there. Anyway, I have no idea about the Yellow Line Lore Master rotation, actually playing it frequently. I haven't done that in a few years, and I haven't because I'm not the biggest fan of Yellow Line Lore Master and playing the support role with it. which you'll probably seen since I don't play it that much. Speaking of Yellow Line Lore Master, Storm Lore will likely move to the red tree. I think that is great. And then Fire and Frost Lore become set bonuses. I actually think that's a really good thing. I wasn't planning on talking about the Yellow Line Lore Master, but this is something that has sort of always bothered me a little bit, in that if you're a Red Line Lore Master or a Blue Line Lore Master, it's a really great idea if you're running group content to actually just go ahead and get these, and then you're basically a support Lore Master at that point. So I would be really happy to see that. Okay, there are other things that they're talking about. In addition to rebalancing, making combo happen. Oh yeah, I'm less familiar. So these are Yellow Line things, it looks like. That's why I'm probably less familiar with the names. All right, didn't see too much there that I can really comment on with the Yellow Line. So let's see the Red Line. Sticky Gourd would actually be granted by specializing in Red Line. I think depending where they go with Blue Line, I'd be perfectly fine with that. It really is a DPS oriented skill, and it makes sense that that would be in the primary Lore Master DPS spec. And then Ring of Fire lose its induction and is placed on the ground in front of you like tar, rather than on your target. Could apply a potent damage over time to enemies that pass through it. Sounds like that's one of the things they did with Sticky Core to remove lag, was have it actually apply the effect directly to the enemy. I'm not entirely sold on this. I kind of don't mind Ring of Fire how it is now. I kind of like that utility of, maybe if it's not ground in front of you, but ground targetable, I might much prefer that personally. I could see that working if they don't want it to be targeted on the enemy, which does sometimes have some issues. Nature's Fury, this one just, deal more damage, that would be great. Oh, they actually have this one as ground targeted. I think that could work as well with just the way it works, basically summoning a tornado at the ground targeted area. Can't deny the fun of that. Curious downside of, no longer moving with your target, but then it's also, this is actually an issue they highlight here. If you use Nature's Fury on your primary target and they die, you basically lose that effect and lose the AoE component, and it does pretty impressive damage, at least relatively. Perhaps not impressive for a minute 30-second cooldown, and having the damage buffed I think would definitely be a good thing, but I kind of like that idea of being ground targeted. If they did that with both Ring of Fire and Nature's Fury, I would probably like the Red Line Lore Master more with that. Oops. The dreaded back button. Anyway, Liquid Fire. This trait could make improved Sticky Gore deal more damage and apply Sticky Tar debuff to enemies. So Sticky Tar being the ground targeted ability that they were considering also changing and perhaps reducing the importantness of it. And I think this is actually a good example when I talk about Red Line Lore Master perhaps being, you still have the debuff theme of the Lore Master, you still have that support theme, but it's a little bit more oriented towards your damage roll. I think this is a good idea of how you can fit that into the Red Line. You have Sticky Gourd, a primary damage dealer, applying a debuff that helps your and your fellow, whoever's attacking the target, damage as well. Ents Go to War, reduce cooldown, change stun to knockdown, and perhaps boost damage a little bit. Pretty straightforward. And then here, with the Blue Line, we're however long into this video, and the whole point of this video was to discuss Blue Line Lore Master. So, with the changes that they are proposing here, this is going to be focused on if the Blue Line Lore Master were an alternative to Red Line Captains. And as you all already know, I'm not a big fan of that idea. I think it is good that they won't have exactly the same kit, but where effects share the name, assume those are mutually exclusive with similarly named Red Line Captain abilities. So it sounds like you wouldn't be able to stack the Red Line Captain and Blue Line Lore Master buffs, which it makes sense balance-wise, but I really don't like that, to be honest. That's my brutal, honest opinion. I don't like that basically at all, even though again it makes sense from a balance perspective. I just don't like that. Anyway, to go ahead and get on, just briefly to actually put it into words, one of the reasons is there would have to be a very clear mechanic where the Red Line Captain and Blue Line Lore Master are explicitly said to have this exact same effect, which does not stack. And how does that make sense at all, that a Blue Line Lore Master and Red Line Captain, you have your Lore Master and Captain, how does that make sense that however they inspire the Fellowship, just because you're already inspired by a Captain means that you don't get any benefit from your Lore Master pet spec? also inspiring you. Anyway, let's go ahead and get moved on from this into the sign of power that we already talked about earlier. This is give your ally the 2 arms effect, rest of the group getting less potent version. I mean, this stuff makes sense from a Redline Captain like buffing spec. Peerless Wisdom, this would cause your pet's debuffing skill to give the Fellowship Redline Captain Inspire effects. And then Raven's Protection effect, so that's, I think, the mitigation one, perhaps. But anyway, this gives Relentless Assault to your group. I'm guessing that's a Redline Captain thing that I'm not as familiar with. And then Eagle, place a hotspot with identical effects to Captain's Banner of War. And then Catmint, Raven effect would no longer impact Benediction of the Raven. Oh, Catmint won't impact Benediction of the Raven, because that's a big use for Catmint for people that are unfamiliar. The Catmint has a lot of different effects for the pets, but if you can see there, the Raven increases the fire mitigation debuff, and of course that's the most important of all these. Like, if it impacts the bear's armor and damage, the main benefit would actually be impacting their abilities or their uses, which is their debuffs, especially at higher levels, and that's the primary one, is going to be the Raven fire mitigation. So yeah, just the more I think about it, I was kind of hoping over time I would kind of be like, yeah, I kind of like this idea of a Redline Captain like Blue Line Lore Master. I don't even necessarily think there's a problem with having an alternative to Redline Captain, somebody that fills a similar role. But the more I think about it, the less and less of a fan I am of it, actually. And just reading these effects makes me terribly unexcited about the Lore Master and just these potential changes. I would, just much rather it be an actual pet-based DPS spec, perhaps even hybrid DPS utility spec, if they really, really didn't want it to be a viable DPS. But another point of this video, besides just the Blue Line Lore Master focus, was to actually see what some of the people on the forums thought. And so we'll see if there are any particular interesting opinions to point out, and kind of summarize perhaps if I see a lot of people liking or disliking the Blue Line Lore Master changes. And I think for Rastamas here, they have a fairly detailed post, which is a great thing, but I think this is a great point from even from somebody who likes group content. I know I haven't played the most of that at 140. Haven't played any with Lore Master because my highest is like 120 something, I forget where. But anyway, they play largely solo, and their wish for Blue Line is actually really like mine. Lean into it actually being a pet specialization. I think that's a great thing. And they also, similar to the ideas that I had earlier about perhaps Blue Line Lore Master, the way they could do pet-based damage spec is to be kind of like the Beastmaster Hunter in World of Warcraft. So you would basically have a skill that is normal player skill, but actually casting it to have the effect on flavor would have your pet, whatever it is, out do something. Or perhaps I even misread that, but I still like that idea. They're actually having, perhaps you could cast and summon a temporary raven. So maybe for like 10 seconds, you could summon a temporary raven that just does whatever it does. I think that would be a great thing as well. I've seen a couple people say that it seems like a good start to them. So it's kind of hard to take a very general comment. That's why I've been skipping over some of those. And then, yeah, this one's also Blue Line Lore Master, looking at it being the solo pet build. I think it doesn't have to be mutually exclusive for it to be a solo pet build and also group content viable as a pet DPS spec. And one thing they're talking about here, I've already commented a little bit on this with the Wizard's Fire, Wizard's Frost, and Wizard's Lightning. They're thinking about like maybe 2 damage skills which you could use on the move. And I think that's again where if they actually did make Wizard's Lightning non-induction based and kept that with Wizard's Fire and Wizard's Frost, I think those could potentially fill that idea that they're talking about some abilities to be used on the move. It looks like this is the first post that I've actually seen in favor of, they at least say interesting and like it, for the offensive group support with the Blue Line Lore Master. And continuing on here, it looks like we do have another person not in favor of the Lore Master having the Blue Line be an alternative to Red Captain. They've always seen them as a debuff and crowd control class, which is true, especially before the trait trees that we had in Helm's Deep. They definitely could do damage, but from what I remember a long time ago, they really were much more heavily into just as an overall class being based around debuffing and crowd controlling. And I think this also gets to one of the reasons I really dislike the idea of having basically the exact same effects for the blue line and red line lore master is that they just like lose their uniqueness and flavor. Even though you're doing two totally different things, you're getting the same outcome from it, really. And I think with pet rotation, something that I should talk about as I read this comment here is I'm not necessarily against the idea of changing your pet every once in a while in combat. Like if you are in a situation where, say, you're fighting a bunch of things in AoE and you have your Sabertooth out, well, then you're left with a single target. Yeah, you can go ahead and change to your links or whatever else you want to use to get that single target down. I'm not against the idea of being able to change your pets in combat, but having some very active rotation with them. And that's again where I'm thinking the 20-second cooldown, 1-minute ability, probably still change pet every 20 seconds to at least very optimally get your debuffs. That's why I'm not initially the biggest fan of that, and think it could be better, even if that's already better than what we currently have. I have seen a couple more posts that are more like indifferent basically towards Blue Line Lore Master, but I am seeing this one, the kind of similar idea of what I had. Skills becoming too much like Lore Master just does the same thing as Captain skill. Yeah, I have to imagine all the complaints if Lightning Storm was actually made like exclusive to the red line and not tradable. This is also something I've seen other people point out, but having 3 wizard skill with Frost, Fire, and Lightning could be a little bit of extra bar clutter than people like. And I could definitely see that. I mean, just even my low-level lore master here, I say low-level, but I'm 67 and have a lot of the base skills for the class. It's a lot of abilities. I have for regularly used stuff, a couple in the control bar, or really Staff Strike, and then this is Red Line, which does have more abilities than Blue Line, and then Shift 1 through Shift 5, while longer cooldown do get used a lot, and then 1 through 7 plus 8, and then a lot of utility stuff is stuck on the right or top bars for me. That's a lot of abilities to keep track of, and again, lower level lore master here. I do think if they kept the blue line as a pet-based spec instead of their proposed changes, I'm not too familiar with lore master traceries off the top of my head, but I think it could be a good idea to have some traceries impact the pet. And yeah, I think this post also makes a pretty good point on kind of why I am not the biggest fan of their proposed changes with the pets that still actually have swapping. So the dismiss and resummon pets during combat, you still have that as your pet essentially being disposable rather than an actual companion that, again, you could feel free, given the situation warrants it, to every once in a while go ahead and swap your pet out. I also agree, one thing that I saw, maybe they haven't explicitly said, but they just gave an example with 3 target DPS on the Saber, is perhaps making it be able to hit a little bit more than 3 targets. Yeah, I'm actually pretty happy that I am seeing more support against Blue Line Lore Master becoming a Red Line Captain alternative, because I remember very first time glancing through this thread, did see a decent bit of support for that, but definitely now seeing a lot less support for the swap of Blue Line Lore Master compared to what I initially saw when I skimmed through, like when this was first posted a week or 2 weeks ago. And I think, again, there are a lot of scattered about here great ideas. I know I'm somewhat skimming it right now, but for blue line specialization, which I'm really focusing on, of course, for this video, I think this is a pretty good creative option, is like have 2 pets out if you're a blue line lore master. That would give a real benefit to playing blue line lore master. And even if it isn't one of the normal pets, which I still think would be great, this is a pet that could be visible, but just follows, and gives Blue Line some unique ability associated with it. It's also true that Landscape isn't just one-shotting gray mobs, it's challenging by being underleveled, or, now with the difficulty system on all servers, using that as I am with my Lore Master and how weak this low-level Lore Master is, it's actually not the fastest thing to go through, even on tier 3, which I treat as the baseline difficulty of the game now, basically. This is also something that I commented on earlier, is that PvMP, basically your landscape experience shouldn't be negatively affected by PvMP, but they also even highlight group content here, which I think is true. I also think the other way around, maybe for PvMP or even group content, changes based on landscape experience shouldn't necessarily negatively affect those either. I know I've mainly focused it on this same reference frame throughout a lot of this video, but I think good to highlight the other way around as well. Anyway, we barely scratched the surface of that thread, and my cats are really just in support of the cat pets being buffed, but right now the utility of the Bog Guardian is what we'll use for some wrap-up thoughts. Yeah, we barely got into the thread with the comments, but I really was going to be sitting there forever if we went through absolutely everything, but I hope you all enjoyed maybe hearing some of my thoughts on the state of the Lore Master, a little bit more detailed, and in the context of the proposed changes that have come out since I did my previous 2 videos on the Lore Master. As usual, please do let me know your thoughts on the Lore Master as a class, the different specializations with it, if you think the blue line should become a red line captain alternative, and also let me know if you do enjoy this type of longer form class discussion type content. Anyway, if you did enjoy, don't forget to like and subscribe, and thanks for watching everyone.